When you're fed up with fighting food and your body, join us here. I'm Allie Shapiro, creator of the Truce with Food program and your host for Insatiable, where we explore the hidden aspects of fighting our food, our weight, and our bodies, and dive deep into nutrition science and true whole health. Fair warning, this is not your parents' health care. This is a big rebel yell to those who crave meaning, hunger for truth, and whose lust for life is truly insatiable. Believe me, freedom awaits. Welcome, everybody, to Season 8 of Insatiable. We are on Episode 1. Welcome back. This season's theme is, drumroll, consistency. It's no secret that consistency is the key to success. Many of us have so much health knowledge, and we are aware of the latest and greatest food research and have the best of intention, and then real life happens. We fall off track, lose motivation, and get discouraged. Convention tells us consistency is about willpower, discipline, and hard work. But research in adult development theory points us elsewhere. 15 years ago, I discovered functional medicine and reversed my irritable bowel syndrome, depression, and a host of issues. I was amazed at the power of food as medicine and felt amazing. But even with all of these great results, I couldn't stop my binging and overeating. My quest to discover why can't I stick with this led me to grad school to study adult development and how we change ingrained patterns and behaviors. I came to realize inconsistency is a symptom, just like depression and binging. It's not the problem, but has various root causes depending on the individual. Not only is falling off track an invitation into deeper healing and radical results, I found that when it comes to consistency, a lot of the common beliefs we have around being consistent are actually what causes us to fall off track. In this Insatiable season, we will look at inconsistency as a symptom, not a problem. We'll explore what happens when the novelty of some, quote, new plan has worn off and why real life trips us up. What are the various root causes of why we lose motivation, want to be bad with our food, and tell ourselves, chuck it, F it. So that's our theme. And today we are talking about the 4 weight loss willpower myths, sabotaging your results. And before I get to our very special guest, I want to welcome back all our loyal listeners we've had over, I was counting, I've been doing this 3.5 years. It's amazing. And in between season 7 and 8, we've had a ton of podcast growth of people finding the podcast through all of you guys who share it. Thank you so much. I appreciate those of you who share the podcast with others. I also want to welcome people from the Rebel Therapist podcast, where I was a guest, from Girl Boss, the online publication that highlighted Insatiable and the great work that we are doing here with our guests and the conversations we're having there. And again, thank you for those who shared the podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about willpower myths, like I just said. Willpower has become this catch-all root cause of why we struggle with our nutrition, food, and weight loss goals. And for regular listeners, you will know I loathe a lack of nuance and clarity. So in today's episode, we're going to expose how that I need more willpower belief is sabotaging you. We're going to illuminate how moments of weakness, and I put that in quotes, are symptoms of other root causes, and show you where to redirect your willpower so you get results that are possible for you. Something I'm so frustrated about is I know what's possible, and I feel like a lot of these willpower myths prevent us from getting to reaching all our goals and a lot more of wonderful relief we didn't know was possible. And to help facilitate this conversation, we have Insatiable community member Justine DeMillo to be part of this conversation as someone on the path to a truce with food and food freedom. So thanks for being here, Justine.
Thanks for having me, Allie.
Yeah. So a little bit for everyone tuning in, Justine is a marketing and proposal professional with over 6 years of experience in proposal writing and content development in the healthcare space. In addition to spending time with family and friends, she loves reading, cooking, shoes, and perhaps most importantly, snuggling under massive piles of blankets. And horses, too. We just like horses, too, which I love, too. Justine graduated with a bachelor's degree in communication from Boston College in 2011, and she lives in Connecticut with her husband and 2 cats. So thanks again for being here, Justine. For everyone listening, this theme of consistency came out of some of the conversations we were having in the Insatiable membership community. So I figured, why not have you come on and we can have a much richer discussion rather than me just lecturing for an hour. So thank you.
Yeah, I love it. I'm so happy to be here and excited that I get to talk about this and dig a little deeper with you.
Yeah. And for everyone listening, we're going to go through some real life examples that Justine was sharing in the community so that you guys can learn as well. But before I get to that, one last thing, I'm like, one more thing. I had announced at the end of last season that I had a really big announcement. And I have to say, I've been sharing it with clients and in our community, and you guys are very intuitive, or I'm a really bad liar or surpriser, but I am pregnant. So super, super excited. I'm going to share more details in another episode, as well as in the next season of Insatiable will probably be around various themes of fertility, parenting, all that kind of stuff, because it's clearly what I'm reading. And what I'm learning is there's so many horrible myths and stereotypes. But I will give you kind of the headline that basically last year, my friend who was 43 and struggling with fertility told me, I wish I would have gotten all my numbers checked out at 39, which was the age I was at the time. And she said, I know you don't like Western medicine, but I would just go and see what your numbers are. So I went, and it was a horrible experience. Basically, they told me that I was in early menopause, most likely from the chemotherapy that I had 27 years ago. And what they could offer me was using a donor egg, which is where you use someone else's egg, and then do IVF. And I could pay $30,000 for that maybe to work. And I'll explain more on another episode, but basically I came to the conclusion that that wasn't the right choice for me. And I decided to work with a naturopath and an acupuncturist and got pregnant on my own in January. Totally caught up by surprise. Wanted to quit my life in February. Didn't know what was happening, if it was because I hadn't seen the sun, and then took a pregnancy test, and here we are. So I'm due in October, and it is a baby boy, which is totally surprising to me. So Carlos and I are definitely going to raise a feminist figure. As a white privileged male, he'll be able to take down the patriarchy a little bit faster than even a white feminist woman. So wish us luck. Yeah. And the only big change, we will still be doing our seasons and, taking breaks in between. But the Why Am I Eating This Now program will start in mid-August rather than after the fall, because I want to make sure that I can completely facilitate it before I go into labor. So super excited still, I'm right now at the time of this recording about halfway through. I'm feeling great, knock on wood, having a very uneventful, healthy pregnancy, but also cautiously optimistic because you never know. And fertility is ultimately a mystery. So just wanted to share all that with you. And again, there'll be much more details in kind of the mindset and some of the things that I learned about my body going through this on episode 5 of this season, and then much, much more in our season 9. Okay. So, Justine, now on to our conversation today.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So just before we've heard your official bio, but I just want people to understand where you're coming from. Why did you decide to join the Insatiable membership community?
Absolutely. I joined the community for so many reasons, but I don't know if this will be helpful for your listeners. So I wanted to give a little bit of background on myself to sort of get to why I felt it was important to join. So I grew up in a larger body, and while I dabbled in a few diets, it wasn't really until after college that I decided it was really going to be my time to lose weight. So I decided to postpone really actively looking for a adult job, I guess you could call it. And yeah,
smart move.
Yeah. And I joined Weight Watchers, and I literally spent the next year working on myself. And I felt like everything was going great. After about a year, I got a full-time job at an insurance company, and everything seemed to be going great. But right around that 5-year mark of losing weight, so we're in about 2016, I just started noticing the weight coming back on. And I felt so out of control because I really didn't know what was going on in my body. And I'm sure you've talked about this before. We like to think that weight and weight loss is simply calories in, calories out, but there's so many things going on in your body that can determine that. So, I was literally rationalizing like, well, if a pound is like 3,500 calories, like I'm not eating that much to gain this much weight. Like that was what was going on in my head. And I just finally hit rock bottom and kind of got to that realization that like dieting in and of itself doesn't work. And as a result, I decided I wanted to begin healing my relationship with food and body. I realized how obsessive my thoughts had become, and I really just wanted to get out of that space. So right now, that's kind of what I'm working on, which is sort of stopping dieting and the food restriction entirely, and working on reconnecting to my body so I can feel like what does make me feel good, because I know that I couldn't get to the what makes me feel good without sort of getting rid of that restriction. And so once I found you on the podcast, I literally tried to figure out when that was, but I could not. I was like, was it a year? Was it 2 years? I don't know. So what I love about listening to your podcast is that the conversations were so like real and practical, and always like what you say is like getting to that root cause. So I've done a lot of like emotional and maybe what some people might consider like woo-woo work around like food and body, but like everything you talk about is so real and practical. So like I like to summarize like what I feel like working with you is like I get to understand like not only why I want something, so like chocolate from an emotional perspective, like we've talked about like, am I feeling lonely because my husband is at home from work and I'm eating dinner alone again? But also like, what's that signaling from a biological perspective? Like, did I meet my needs for carbs, fat, protein throughout the day? And then also like, I get to be at choice when I want that chocolate. So if I do decide that I want it, because I can put myself back in power, like have I balanced my blood sugar in a way that I can have that chocolate, but I'm not going to get a bellyache. And like, that's what I feel like the conversations I get with you are about, and like what I'm learning in the community. So I absolutely love it.
Oh, wonderful. And I thank you so much for sharing your story, because I know so many people listening are going to connect with that, right? And
yeah.
And the culture tells you it's a willpower issue. And to your point, like when you start digging into the research, it's like, oh no, dieting is what causes the weight gain.
Mm-hmm.
It's not my willpower. It's
right.
That I had too much willpower to do this bullshit. No,
exactly. I
did. Yeah, we're going to get into that today. So I love that. And I love that you brought up that we focus on a holistic perspective, because I think when we look at some of the willpower myths today, we're going to look at it from like both angles, because as we were talking about on the Q&A call yesterday in the Insatiable membership community, you know, how you're feeling in your physical body, like blood sugar and gut health, influences your moods. But then your moods also, if you're feeling good or depressed or sad, or lonely, also influences your physiology. And so it's this infinity feedback loop. And if without looking at both, we're just not going to be able to get the results that are possible. So awesome. Well, that's an amazing intro and background. Thank you. So I want us to start first by looking at what willpower even is. As someone who is can dabble in, you know, coaching, it's all about making sure we're all talking about the same term. So I looked up the definition of willpower, and it said that it's basically control exerted to do something or restrain impulses, which we typically think of as self-control. And I love that Justine was talking about feeling out of control. I used to feel that way all the time with food, right? And so you assume like, if I'm out of control, I need more self-control. And in willpower is mostly thought of as the ability to resist short-term temptations and desires in order to achieve long-term results. So when I was thinking about this, what we hear in the food world is like, you have to skip the brownie so you can lose weight, right? Or throw your gym clothes on and go run even when you don't want to. And I think what's really important is that this definition implies that short-term and long-term success are at odds, right? And this core story will make you think you're on the right track when you're resisting cravings, rather than seeing them as a symptoms you aren't eating the right things for you. Or say like with exercise, that makes you think, oh, no pain, no gain. If I hate this exercise, it's working, which then research shows us that the more we think exercise is a sacrifice, we underestimate how much we're burning from exercise, and we overestimate how much we're burning, and we underestimate how much we're eating in reaction to that exercise. So it really sets ourselves up for failure if these short-term and long-term goals or satisfaction is at odds. And Justine, it made me think on one of our Q&A calls, like you started to realize some of the rules that you're living by. And you were saying how you get hungry for lunch at 11:30.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, eat then, right?
Yeah.
Rather than trying to be good and push through to noon, which is maybe what a diet would say, or someone was like, right. So like, isn't it better to satisfy your hunger than to suffer?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Because I think it's like I was getting to that 11:30, and even without diet culture, like I think lunch is at noon. So I was waiting and pushing myself till that. And then, we've talked about like eating slowly and trying to be present is one of the things I really want to do. But by waiting, all I was doing was like getting myself farther from that place. So I'd be like eating way more because I just needed to eat because my body was so depleted, versus like had I just ate lunch at 11:30 and been okay with that, then it would have been like, okay, I can like eat and actually pay attention to my body because I'm not so like frazzled and trying to meet those needs quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned blood sugar. It's like, so by pushing through and thinking by foregoing this short-term satisfaction, your body is like, I'm dying.
Exactly.
Oh man. I know things have multiple root causes, but the Puritans and their influence on us and that like discipline and denial, like it really has affected our health.
Oh my gosh, it really has. And I feel like it's such an interesting, we don't even like to think about that. And that's again, like one of the things I love about chatting with you is like, there is so much of that, like discipline and hard work and all of that. Everything we do has to be like hard for us to like deserve it. And that's not the case.
Right. Okay. So according to the American Psychological Association, most psychology researchers define willpower as 1, the ability to delay gratification and resist short-term temptations to meet long-term goals, the capacity to override an unwanted thought, feeling, or impulse, the conscious, effortful regulation of the self by the self, and that willpower is a limited resources capable of being depleted. And I really like this definition of willpower. I think it's complete. I think it's thorough. But what I have a beef with is because, and I'm using that pun intended. Do you remember Wendy's? Where's the beef? Or are you too young? You might be too young.
No, I think I remember it.
Okay. Well, anyone that's like 40 or over will remember. It was like one of the most popular commercials. But so few people, researchers included, actually understand our relationship to food. They don't see the whole picture. So Justine and I are going to go through each of these like definition points and show the ways and times willpower is completely unrelated to our food choices, and how many of the like motivation quotes that we think are inspiring us, like no pain, no gain, or nothing tastes as good as thin feels, are actually sabotaging our story. They try to reinforce this sabotaging story that, again, I think the core story here that we filter so much through is you have to resist short-term satisfaction for long-term gain. Whereas I hope after today, if you get nothing from this episode, that if you feel good in the short term, you have a better chance of feeling good in the long term. And we'll get to like wanting to make the healthy choice and blah, blah, blah. So the first one is the ability to delay gratification and resist short-term temptations to meet long-term goals. And again, I said, I think that this is best summed up in a mantra that I learned at all my Weight Watchers meetings was nothing tastes as good as thin feels, right? There's that delay the gratification.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And similar to what Justine was saying is if you've been listening to Insatiable for a while, we focus on the root causes of why you fall off track with your eating or any healthy habits. And so there's several root causes of why we quote cave or can't resist, focusing quote on this like quote unquote short term versus long term that are unrelated to willpower. And I think Justine's example of the timing of her meals is a perfect example. One that I wanted to share with you guys was kind of x-raying what used to happen to me in my corporate office. I used to work at a commercial real estate company before I left the corporate world, and these are high ticket items that people are buying, office buildings and stuff. And so clients would send these gourmet cookies or chocolate covered pretzels covered in M&Ms to the office. And I love peanut M&Ms. I mean, I still like them. I just don't eat them as often. And they'd put them in the break room, and I'd see them in the morning, and like all morning I'd be like, I'm not having those. I'm not, I'm being good today. And I'd be able to resist. And by the afternoon, I was eating them when no one was in the kitchen, right? Once everyone was gone, like I would go in, pretend I'm getting water. If someone was in there, I would leave with my water. But when someone wasn't, I was eating them. And I really thought I had a willpower problem because I had been battling food at that point for 12 years. Let's see, I first went to Weight Watchers 11. Yeah, so it had been actually probably more like 15 years because I was struggling before that. So I assumed it was a willpower problem, but this is where it gets nuanced because research, and I agree with this, shows us that resisting food actually does deplete our willpower, which is like so cruel, right? Like, oh God. However, what I didn't know at the time were there were two root causes of why I was eating those things. The first one was I wasn't eating the right foods for me. I need animal protein at lunch, and I was also skipping carbs, trying to be low carb. So craving carbs is a natural attempt to rebalance my physical needs because my blood sugar was so out of whack. So my body, which is me too, right? We aren't separate from our bodies, was trying to focus on the short and long-term survival of itself. Because without the right energy supply, you can't keep the lights on, right? In my case, I was always crashing in the afternoon. I couldn't focus at my job. And at the time, though, I thought I was getting by okay, which is, I think, the most challenging part of this. I could have felt so much better. So there was a physiological imbalance, and the willpower belief made me so uncurious to learn about my own body. And it reinforced the belief that I didn't have enough willpower, making it harder to be curious and believe it was anything other than me being broken. Now, you might be thinking, if you are a skeptic and sometimes cynical like me, when people are trying to change your mind, well, then why don't you just eat an apple, right? Because they also send a fruit basket, right, Justine?
Yeah, I mean, of course, like, don't you want the fruit is just so different, but yes, I mean, maybe it was an edible arrangement, so maybe there's some chocolate with your fruit. We get those.
Yeah. And if I were listening to this of me 15 years ago, I'd say, well, if you had more willpower, you would have chosen an apple. But there's usually an emotional component to why we need short-term gratification. And again, Justine and I said this in the beginning, there's usually a couple root causes, and we have to look at both, the physical and emotional. So for me, I was so deprived of meaning at my work that my energy was low. I wasn't stimulated or feeling happy a lot. I mean, I was on antidepressants, seeing a therapist. I was like, what am I doing with my life? So that's where the sweets came in. They were the solution to being unfulfilled in my career, not a willpower problem. In fact, I look now at those cravings as like invitations to a richer, deeper life and getting me on track with what was important for me. But I didn't know any of this because I ended up in the corporate world because of how disciplined I was about chasing good grades and gold stars that didn't give me short or long-term gratification. It definitely gave me financial security and health insurance, and that's a lot. But something inside me knew that I could have more. And so as I went back to nutrition school while working, not right away, but I started to think, like, what would give my days more meaning? I didn't just quit my job right away. I don't think most people can do that unless you have a trust fund or you're a really big risk taker, which I'm not. But really start to think about what really brings me joy in the short term, not just in, I'm doing this because I need a paycheck and it's going to pay off in retirement in 40 years. I don't even know if people can retire at 70 anymore. But again, focusing on the short term and what brought me joy, I started to get so interested in what I was learning at nutrition school, and it filled me up in a way that my job couldn't. But as I got more into that, the sweets didn't serve a purpose anymore because I was finding that happiness and that stimulation elsewhere. So is this clear, Justine? And
100%. And I think, I so also relate to your story about like being the overachiever. Like same thing. I was, really trying to get perfect grades in high school and college and do all the right things to get the right job. And like literally taking that break before getting a job was like literally like heartbreaking to me. I ended up turning down a job offer like right after graduation. So I 100% get that. And I actually, while you were sort of giving your examples, I had a couple of things that sort of came up for me. And sort of the first part you made about like eating the foods that are right for you. So again, Weight Watchers alum as well. One of my personal big like food stumbling blocks is making sure I'm getting enough fat, because like anyone that knows the point system knows that like fats, even healthy fats like olive oil, avocados, whatever, are like really high in points. So, I mean, I remember legitimately measuring out a teaspoon of olive oil a day for salad.
Oh.
And I just, yeah, like, because you check off that you got your 2 little oil servings.
Yeah, I remember that. And
yes,
the little circles.
yes. So, and I literally, when I got to the end of my like Weight Watchers time, I knew I wasn't getting enough fat. Like I knew that my body needed it, but it's one of those things that has become so ingrained. I have to consistently remind myself to like put that on the menu for the day, and also on even just on my shopping list to grab some like nuts or some like nut butter, or, you know, any avocados, oils. Like I have to remember that I actually do need those things. And when I'm craving something, like it could be that symptom, like you said, of maybe I'm not actually getting the right proportion of what I need. And that really doesn't have anything to do with willpower. It's just your body's way of communicating with you. But we are so reliant on, when we're dieting, like these external food rules, like we don't understand that that craving is for something that our body actually needs.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially because, I mean, all of us who grew up, I mean, in the last 20 years have just heard how bad fat is. Right. And we
right.
So it's like, I think we have to have compassion for ourselves that we're in this really unhealthy surround sound, not only of diet culture, but of quote unquote health experts too. And like, finding your way out is like taking, like, I've never seen that show, the movie The Matrix, but you have to want to take the red pill, right? Or what pill did you?
I saw it once. I don't remember which pill, whatever pill you're supposed to take.
Yeah. If you want to be free.
Yeah. And then when you were talking about like, well, yeah, why didn't I choose an apple? I actually like had sort of 2 thoughts there. And the conversation we've been having this month about soul hunger. So that exercise where you asked us to sort of like think about that meal that was like the best thing and why it was the best meal, and which pretty much had nothing to do with the food that you were eating and more like what was going on around the meal. And I think that really became crystal clear to me last week. So I told you before this that I was managing a horse show for 5 days. I had a staff of almost 20 people, and there were probably 150 exhibitors. So what I had noticed was that like if we were sitting down to dinner, I could like just for whatever reason not be connecting with anyone, and I would feel myself like butting up against that like fullness cue, but then I would keep going because I was just not connecting with people. But then if I was engaging with some of them in like a meaningful conversation, maybe about what had happened that day, or even just what was going on with their life, getting to know them, it was so much easier to listen to my body when it told me to stop. And I understand that sounds 100% counterintuitive, that it was easier to pay attention when I wasn't paying attention. But in that moment, that connection with people were filling my needs, and it wasn't the food. Whereas when I wasn't connecting, I was using food to like fill that connection need. But like we know that no amount of food's ever going to fill those emotional needs.
Yeah, that is such an amazing example because, you know, I often call it like phantom hunger, right? When we're like, why am I doing this? Even though I'm full. And like, again, if we think it's a willpower issue, we don't know to look. And I think that's the biggest challenge, even with emotional eating and intuitive eating approaches, traditional ones, is they're like, well, like they're still focused on the food versus it's these invisible patterns, right?
Absolutely.
That are affecting us, and we don't know what we don't know. So we don't know what to look for because we're in this cultural surround sound that it's a willpower issue. And I think that's a great segue of like going deeper again of this idea that like on a deeper level, when we're eating, it's because we feel lonely in a social situation, or I mean, I eventually could say that I was like basically numbing out because my whole life was like unaligned with what I wanted. we aren't really getting short-term gratification from eating, right? It's like, it tastes good for sure. I don't want to deny that. But like when I used to be binging or overeating, it was like, but I hate myself for doing this. And how am I going to make up for this? And when am I going to stop? And like, am I just going to keep going? And like, I'm out of control. And so like this idea that we're getting all this short-term gratification from overeating to me is just a big fallacy. It's like, no, and often even the taste, it tastes good for like a couple bites, but then after that, you're just like, I'm making myself sick. And it's that extra, right? That like the short-term gratification, it's not even short-term gratification, it's protecting ourselves. And that's not a comfortable way to live, to feel like we always have to be on guard. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because again, it's not about delaying short-term gratification. It's connecting with that group and saying, oh, wow, this is what I need and want. And this is so fun. Or at least feel more connected. And I'm learning how to, not avoid in a group or what I want, connection or whatever. And that's a point. Again, if you haven't taken the comfort eating quiz style, I'll include the link in my show notes. But part of this willpower issue is that, we avoid speaking up because we don't want to rock the boat, or we accommodate other people so that they aren't disappointed, and right, we people please them, or we compete, and like all day we're just driving so hard, ignoring our body's needs. And it's actually like so much willpower and discipline of how we think we need to be that is the problem. That's not giving us short-term gratification or long-term gratification, because then we don't learn how to connect. We don't learn what we really need. And our life can't be as full as is possible. So thank you so much for sharing that example. It was a great teaching point.
Perfect. And I think too, like what you're saying is like that willpower feels like we need to like sacrifice our short-term goals to achieve those long ones. But I feel like it's more accurate that our short-term goals and long-term goals should go hand in hand. Like that definition implies that they're at odds, and I don't think that they need to be. So like when you skip the dessert, which is like the short-term pleasure, in favor of like a long-term health goal, like health, weight loss, whatever you think it's going to be. But when you take that willpower out of the equation, it's like, what's going to feel good right now? Because I think, you've said like, it's really got to feel like the short term has to go into the long term. And like one dessert is not going to derail every long-term goal I've ever had.
Great point.
Right? And when you think about, and I think when I say feel good now, I don't just mean like, does it feel good in my body right now, but does it feel good in my overall life? So if sharing dessert with my husband is while connecting might actually be in the service of the long-term goal of having a happy and healthy marriage. So it's not just about like health and weight loss either.
Exactly. It's everything, because we need, and this is actually the episode too, is about sneak peek, belonging. and belonging is we get into, it's a skill set, not necessarily a place, but belonging is an important health metric, and feeling really connected and that kind of stuff is just as important as what you eat. So I think that's a really, really great point. It reminds me, I got this email from a client, and we've done a lot of work together, and I haven't talked to her in a while. And she's just like, hey, I just wanted to email you. She goes, I don't know if this makes any sense, but she's like, I started working with a trainer, and she's like, he had me just like loosely track my macros. She's like, and it's funny. She's like, he told me to cut back on my fat, but I knew I needed more fat. But she's like, after the work we had done together, she's like, it wasn't like a diet. She's like, it was in the back of my mind, not in the front of my mind. It was super loosey-goosey, like in terms of like, it wasn't Weight Watchers counting, right? It was just kind of like, let's eyeball this and get some awareness. And she's like, I've lost 35 pounds, I think she said, I think in the past like 6 or 7 months. I'm not doing the math great right now, but she's like, she goes, the crazy thing is, she's like, sure, I'm happy. She goes, but in the past, she goes, I would have been thrilled. And she goes, I don't even care. She's like, not that she didn't care, but it wasn't the same like, woohoo. And she's like, is this making any sense? And I was like, she goes, and I wrote her back. I'm like, the key you said in this email is you realized that like your weight loss wasn't going to change your life. And all the work that we had done, as well as she had been working with a counselor, it's like, once you get that, like, you can have so like my point in sharing this is like her process was enjoyable. And so then she had more likely chance of sticking with it. And it led to weight loss, but also like that actually wasn't her goal. It was just to be like, oh, let me see how this goes. And it's feeling really good. And she really fell in love with weight training, actually, which was something that she discovered about herself. And I'm like, that's what I'm talking about. Like, I can honor that people want to lose weight and whatnot. And if your body's meant to do that, it will, but you still have to enjoy the process, and you can't put off, like, I thought her point about, like, I really understood my life wasn't going to change. She really started advocating for her needs and creating that life that she wanted, 35 pounds before.
Yeah. And what I love about that example too is, like when her trainer, so who supposedly is the expert, is like, cut down on fat, like she knew that her body needed that. And I think that's so important too. Like, you have to be able to connect with what your body needs and feels good in it. And I think to me, that was like a great part of the story as well.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. I think I take it for granted because, like, once my clients work with me, they know how to make the tools adapt for them, and they just feel so much more confident in their own authority. So thanks for pointing that out. So one of the things that someone in the Insatiable membership community asked was like, hey, can you give us some ways to measure consistency if we're not doing it the traditional way? And I think the big thing is, when it comes to short-term versus long-term gratification, if you feel good today, you have the best chance of feeling better tomorrow. And this is, I remember learning about nutrition, and as a cancer survivor, a lot of people recommend going vegan and vegetarian. This is an example of, like, I cannot thrive on that kind of diet. I was eating all this sugar, all these fake meats. And I was like, look, if I'm doing this, like, if I feel really great today, I think that's the best chance I have of feeling really great in 20 years. And also with exercise, again, I think with my clients' example, a lot of times I got a question the other day in a webinar I was doing about, like, I know running makes me feel so great, but when I'm really stressed out, like at work, I just can't get myself out of bed in the morning. And I was like, well, this is a perfect example of, like, maybe people would tell you that you're falling off track or that you need the run to release stress, but your body's saying, wait a second, it's time to harmonize. You're under so much stress. You're not getting enough sleep. Running probably isn't the best exercise at that time. And it's more about restoration. And so that's another example of measuring, like, does this exercise actually make me feel better afterwards? And is it supporting me with what I'm doing now? So that's another way of measuring short-term and long-term gratification. In terms of if you're eating the right foods for your body, again, all signs that your days are going to be easier. Cravings going down, energy going up, your mood's more stable, sleep gets better. It's easier to pass up previous tempting foods. And from an emotional perspective, you start to look more forward to your days. Doesn't mean every day is perfect, but more want to, I say life on your terms. More I'm choosing versus the masturbation that Dr. Albert Ellis talks about.
I feel like you need to define that term. Yeah. I'm laughing.
Yeah, so he was a cognitive behavioral therapist at Penn. I think he still lives in Philly, if he's still alive. But his concept masturbation was when we say to ourselves, I must, I have to, I should, I've got to, versus when it's like what you said at the top of the podcast is when I'm in choice. Actually, I'm choosing this, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm choosing to connect here rather than ignore that, rather than thinking I need more food here. Or I'm Absolutely. Choosing to share a piece of cake with my husband because we're out at a really fun restaurant and they're known for these desserts, or maybe they're not. It's just, that's what you want. So much of this, of feeling back in control about food is being in choice in our life and in all the ways. So again, that's the big piece. Okay, so now on to willpower component number 2, which is a nice dovetail if we're talking about masturbation into the capacity to override an unwanted thought, feeling, or impulse. So I think one of the classic willpower motivations myth, which Laura from the community offered, is put your mind to it and you'll get results. Push out, negative thinking, or, so much inner critic work, and, always directed at women because no one realizes it's not about criticalness, it's protectiveness, but we'll get to this. So related to food, this is the classic, I shouldn't eat this, but I want to eat this. I'm not going to, but I deserve it. Right? That's like, okay. Mm-hmm. Then you get tips like, don't bring trigger foods in the house. Ask yourself if it's worth it in the moment. Or if you're learning to get out of the diet mentality, it's ignoring the food police or urge to go on another diet. Can you think of any, Justine, that maybe I missed that sometimes?
I literally Pinterested this a little bit. So like what you eat in private is what you wear in public. Yeah.
What the fuck?
I saw that like on one of those little like memes, like when I was like Pinteresting like motivation quotes. Yeah, it's really bad.
Wow. Yeah. So again, surround sound, right? It's everywhere. Yep. So our culture, we talk about this a lot, mostly stays on the surface, takes everything at face value, the shallow end of life, which sometimes is fun, but not when you're struggling. So what are the food police or body image really about? What are we putting our mind to? And why are we trying to override our feelings? I think the perfect example is Justine and your event with the horse at the horse show. Like, you had a need to connect. Why would you override that,
Right.
But when the food police are on the scene or we're out with others and want to make the, quote, bad choice, it's important to realize these thoughts, feelings, and impulses are actually protective. So, Justine was mentioning that in May or June. Wait, what's today? May. Yeah, May.
Yeah, still May.
Yeah, hunger was our spring theme, and we were focused on. We did physical hunger, emotional hunger, and soul hunger was the last one that we explored. And I asked people like, what do you remember about the best meal you ever had, where you really enjoyed it, and you ate like portion control or was like super simple. And every single person was like, wow, it wasn't about the food. It was, for some people, it was the ambiance. It was the exotic location. Other people, it was the company or a combination. But everyone started to notice that when they started to feel self-conscious about food was when they didn't know people as well. Right? Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. And it could be people too. I want to say, like, when I think about this, I feel like I also get into, like, people I know that like have different thoughts than I do about food. I don't know if that makes so. Like, for example, my father is a little bit like old school when it comes to like nutrition. So like, yeah, like fat's like terrible and all these things. And when we were at the show, there was like an ice cream social, and I had taken my ice cream and saved it in the freezer just because I was telling myself that I didn't want the ice cream. Thinking about it now, it really had nothing to do with that I didn't want it, and more that I was gonna, it's proper to eat it after dinner, and I hadn't eaten dinner. But when I did take it out later that day, like, my dad made a face at me, and honestly, he's always been a little bit judgmental when it comes to my food choices. So like in that moment, I spiraled 100%. I felt judged and like guilty. So I like want to say like too, that it can be people, but it's also like what you either know that they think about food or make up that they think about food.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you put that. Yeah, because I think that's actually when we often feel the most lonely and isolated is when it's people we should be really close with and be able to say, can we talk about these like judgmental thoughts or judgmental statements, and having that emotional intimacy that can be scary. But that's such a great point. I'm so glad that you brought that up. For sure. Yeah. Great point. And then you bring up the point that it's really important to understand that this resistance and this thinking about food and spiraling, it's protective resistance. It's not stuff that you just override or ignore. You have to pull it apart because that's where the freedom and choice are. And so the real willpower emphasis and discipline needs to be on self-awareness of how can we respond to this rather than just react in these triggering situations, like what Justine just described. Yes, you're going to need willpower to get out of your comfort zone and override the thought that people are judging you, or override the want to avoid even having this conversation. But that's where the willpower needs to focus on. And this is so important because I'm not saying that all willpower, it requires no willpower, but I just want you to put it in the right direction. And, I think about, this is kind of random, but we talk a lot about growth mindset in Why Am I Eating This Now? Truth with Food and on this podcast. And a lot of people are familiar with Dr. Dweck's work. And for people who aren't, growth mindset is this concept of that you praise kids for their effort rather than their results. Because if you only praise them, for saying, hey, you're smart, then kids think they're either smart or not. and they get locked into what's called a fixed mindset. Versus if you say, hey, you tried really hard and keep going, kids start to realize that they can learn success, they can learn smartness, they can learn whatever results that they want. And it's an amazing theory, right? And it kind of flips a lot of what we've heard. However, as ideas go mainstream and popular, people take on a life of their own. And Dr. Dweck had to write an article following up saying, and she also learned a lot as people used her work, was saying, I love that all of this has come on, but I think we've confused that you don't want to praise kids just to praise them. Like if they're still not learning math or they're still not learning reading, that's not what growth mindset is about. It's about trusting them that they can do the work and giving them different approaches so that they can learn. And I feel like in the health and wellness space, we're often saying, well, just be compassionate with yourself or be kind. And that is so important. But to me, being kind is saying, I trust that you can look at this. I trust that you can make changes. I know I have compassion that this is challenging and you can still do it. And to me, that is kindness and respect. And it's the right effort where we should be redirecting our efforts. Otherwise, we're just working really hard on the wrong problem. So I just want to say that you do need some willpower, but it's around this self-awareness of what are your emotional triggers, what's your stress response, what are your behaviors. And that, again, is where I think the willpower needs to be directed. I get questions all the time. Well, what about if I'm traveling? Or what about in social situations or family, right? And the reality is we are the common denominator in all of those situations. And it's not the external environment, it's the internal experience that it brings up in us. And hey, is it fair that we have to be the ones to deal with all this? Not always. But often we make things a lot harder and a lot more unsafe for us. And there's a whole, we've talked about this in several episodes. It's out of the scope of this episode, but I just want people to realize that it's really important to understand that overriding your thoughts and feelings around food is not getting to the root of the problem. You're not understanding what's really happening. I feel like I've gone on. Justine, save me.
No. I really like that. And what I feel like is kind of, I think we might talk about it in a little bit more detail later. Like that safety piece, I feel like is so important because like when you think about why we stay stuck in like dieting for so long, it's because that like you feel safe because the diet gives you like a set of like rules, if that makes sense. And then like we also assume that like safety means that we're comfortable, but that's like actually not true at all. Safety can be as comfortable as, whatever. It's just like what's familiar. So like, I think that's what's been so interesting is like, again, we think it's willpower, but you've mentioned this a couple of times, like a lot of our behaviors are really more protective in that way than anything else. And once we realize that again gives us the power to be at choice.
Yes. And if you guys want to understand more about food police and we call mental food gymnastics, and again, all of these will be in the show notes, every episode I mentioned, but season 4, episode 2, which we actually just reran, Inner Food Rebel or Self-Protection, and the pros and cons of intuitive eating, season 7, episode 7. So some of the key metrics that you can start to measure around not overriding your thoughts and feelings around food is, can I recognize the food police, mental gymnastics, and any self-doubt gymnastics, or as Justine said, spiraling, as protective resistance? Can I start to recognize what I feel like this is protecting me from? Am I clear on the root cause of why my mind darts to food? For example, when I want to eat to procrastinate, what is it that I'm avoiding? Or why am I going through the drive-thru? What's causing me to feel unsettled? And then once you can clearly recognize your triggers and patterns and behaviors, which takes some time, although again, if you want to speed that process up, why am I eating this now is exactly why I created that. You want to start to say, am I recognizing these patterns faster when I'm in situations where food stresses me out? So Justine, you had shared an example in the community about a recent time, and I would love to just kind of like x-ray that for people so we can really bring this to life.
We're talking about the in-laws example, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the things that came up for me, and it's funny, it's sort of repeating itself in May a little bit, but we, in March, were going through a lot of like period of change. So we, were getting our floors redone and we had to move in with the in-laws for several days. It wasn't quite a week, but it might have felt like a week. So what I had noticed in myself was that I wasn't eating with presence, which is kind of like my number one goal right now, because I feel like eating with presence allows me to get curious and like notice like it's sort of that stepping block to be able to notice what foods feel good and what don't. And two, I had been trying to incorporate some more like gentle movement, because for me, exercise is either like HIIT training or nothing. So
part of the same all or nothing. I hear it.
Yes. So I was trying to do some more like gentle movement practice. And when we moved in that short period of time and dealing with all that chaos, I realized that like both of those things totally went out the window.
Yeah. So when moving in with your in-laws, what emotion did that bring up for you?
Yeah. So I think there were a couple things going on. I think first of all, change of anything is scary. So like when we were talking about safety, like that feeling of like being uncertain and in a way like out of control. So like being in someone's else's house, like makes you feel a little bit like powerless. Like, and I think this goes to my accommodator pattern. Like I had to do what they wanted, like eat when they wanted to eat, like watch what they wanted to watch, go to bed when they wanted to go to bed, and like sort of feeling that sense of like unsettled and like powerless was definitely there.
I love that. You just mapped it for me. I didn't even have to. But uncertainty was the trigger, which many people use the word anxious. But again, what they're feeling is uncertain. The stress response, because it's your in-laws, right? And our stress response will be different often based on who we're with or the different trigger. But so I have to accommodate, right? That's the assumption, right? That's the protective response, right? Because we get praise when we people please and we're easy to be with and right? It's like,
yes.
Like, let's be real. These things aren't all bad. These stress responses, they've gotten us a lot of great things in life. And so then the behaviors become, just going with the flow, right? And like adapting. And that's what makes us feel out of control. There's all this stuff going on below. And so what happens when we're in the accommodator response, part of why we feel powerless and out of control is we have this frame of it's either I get my needs met or my in-laws get their needs met, right? So we may not think of it that way. It's like, but how the chatter is I don't want to put them out. They're being nice enough to let us stay here, right?
Right. Oh, 100%. And even just like, if I think back to like that, when we were talking about like how I have to sometimes eat lunch a little bit earlier. So my husband and I tend to eat dinner like 5:36. We're like grandparents in that way. But his parents don't eat until like 7:30. So I was literally starving by the time we ate dinner, just because I was accommodating their eating schedule and what they wanted to eat, as opposed to like thinking about what I needed.
Yeah. And so the new behavior then is we start to think of like, well, how do I want this weekend to end? Right. Once we understand what's happening, then we can start to say, how do I want this to end? What's really important to me here? And if you had to go back and do it, because hindsight, this is how we learn. Everything we say, why am I doing this now, is enters with food research, great research. And we learn more from when things aren't working than when they are. So what would have been ideal?
I think I would have prepared myself more with like food and snacks too, to just from a standpoint of like keeping my blood sugar and in general, like keeping my level of hunger at a minimum. I think that definitely would have happened. Just because I know that they eat at different times, because his mother works much different hours than I do. So that definitely would have happened. And I think I would have, and it's funny, I'll say this, even though I ended up coming home every day, because I was sort of like, I don't want to say supervising, but supervising the work that was going on at our house. But I think I would have set more time for just me and made sure that I had that time and wasn't sort of focused on like, well, we're here, so we have to spend time with them. And it didn't help that we had to move the cat. So I was like trying to, be with them, but maybe instead of like using that time with the cats to like pet them, like I could actually use that to be in my own space and reconnect with myself.
Yeah. So I love that because part of this process is learning what we actually need, right? Because we often, not only do we not know how to feed our bodies, we don't know how to feed ourselves emotionally. And we're often unaware until we're like, oh, that's what I would have needed. And I think the other thing that, it would be interesting to experiment with is like having the conversation with his parents of, recognizing that if it's important to like enjoy yourself and enjoy their time with them, does that have to mean eating at the same time? And is that important to them? Is that important to you? Right. So a lot of times we just don't have the conversations and we just assume things rather.
Right.
And that's what our story makes us do is like, oh no, they want us to eat together, blah, 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 versus saying like, hey, we normally eat earlier, but if we'd love to sit with you and like chat, right? Or like thinking of other alternatives rather than the all or nothing. Like I either eat with them and I'm the good
Yeah.
good. Oh my God, why am I saying daughter-in-law? I was going to say wife-in-law. Oh my God.
It's fine. I'll be your wife-in-law.
Or I'm the bitch or I'm the high maintenance person who has to eat at 5:30,
Right.
And so does that feel like something that would be comfortable or something that you could try for next time?
Absolutely. And I feel like one of the things I just noticed, and I don't know if you have thoughts on this because I feel like some people might pick it up or might feel the same way. Like it's interesting because like when I said I was eating, I liked that connection and sitting with people, but then I also know that I need time to myself to like get back into my body. So I see there that there's like two conflicting needs and balancing those. So I think that will be something I need to explore going forward, but I don't know if you had thoughts on that because I realized that like, at one point I say I like the connection, then other times I'm like, no, I need to connect more with me.
That is actually a very dynamo nuanced point. So what happens is, and I don't, a lot of terms right now are people saying they're HSP or they're empaths or whatnot. And for sure, some of us are more sensitive than not. I don't want to hear people say HSP. I'm not saying HSPs aren't a thing. I'm not saying empaths aren't a thing. However, when we have these stories that are unresolved trauma from our past, and again, trauma doesn't have to mean you were in a war or a refugee, right? Trauma is when it could be neglect. It could be being bullied for your weight. It's any time that we really feel like our needs weren't met. So what happens is we continue these patterns forever. And on top of all of that, as women, we are socialized to want to be wanted. And so to want to be wanted means you always have to be attuning to what the other person wants, right? And so as we heal and get healthier, we don't take on other people's energy as much because those holes have been patched over with our own strength. I don't know if that metaphor is too esoteric.
No, I get it.
Okay. Because I'm like super sensitive person. I mean, and I used to be a sensitive person in a very reactive way and a very much like taking on other people's stuff. And I see this with my clients as they get healthier and whole and more whole. It's almost like you're not as porous because you feel you're creating that inner sense of safety for yourself. And you realize that other people's approval or what they're doing is separate from you. It's like a healthy boundary, right? And our body is a boundary, but many of us can't sense it because we've left our bodies because they were unsafe or the emotions are now too much because we haven't addressed them. So I think that's an excellent question and point, and something that I really want as you start to advocate for yourself more, notice how it gets easier and you need less time to settle into yourself because you've been in yourself the whole time.
Yeah, I love that point. It kind of, I apologize, this is derailed slightly from willpower.
No, it has everything to do with it.
But it's so funny because as you say that, like I've noticed, the more time I spend with myself, I've always sort of considered myself a sensitive person, but I do definitely more so now that I'm reconnecting to my body, like notice that I take on even more. Like this is going to sound like the most ridiculous thing ever, and I apologize, but I was in the car a couple of weeks ago and I was listening to some music, and that, I don't know if you know this song. I believe it's a country song. It's about like 3 wooden crosses on the side of the road. And like, it's like the story of like this like crash and, why these 3 people died. And like, literally I was sobbing. And I realized that like, now that I've reconnected, now you're right. Now I need to like put more boundaries in place so that I stop taking that on from anyone, including a song.
But I want to say though, when you first get back into your body, it's like I always say, what we resist persists and what we embrace dissolves. So I always use this analogy, and why I'm editing this now in Truth with Food is like, when we first get back into our body, it's kind of like turning on a hose after winter.
Yes.
And like all that rust comes out before the clear water comes out.
Yes.
Am I making up metaphor? Like, do people still water their lawns? Do people still use hoses, or is there like a virtual app for that? I don't know.
There probably is still a virtual app for that, but I know what you mean.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot.
My frame of reference is the 80s and 90s. So when we first get back into our bodies, it's like, oh my God, there's all this stuff on the surface that we think we've been resisting, and we think, that we've been avoiding and dodging, but it's all there, which is why we're so sensitive about everything else, and why we react to things in a way that often feel disproportionate, because we're not reacting to just that uncertainty or that inadequacy. We're reacting to all of the uncertainty and inadequacy we never dealt with. I mean, when I didn't realize this, but the PTSD from having had cancer, that made me so afraid of uncertainty. But over time, because it was never addressed, I became doubtful about everything, because everything felt so uncertain, and things that normally should be able to be a good decision. It's like, well, I can see it from this angle, and not in a healthy way, not in a discerning way, in a panicked, like, I don't know what I should do. I don't know what I should do. Right. And so it got magnified of like, yeah, it came out of like, can I date if I'm not the weight I want? Right. That's uncertainty. But then it also became like, oh my God, I don't know what to eat for dinner. Right. And so then you look to the experts because you think they know. But it was, what should I do with my life? Why am I in a corporate career? My parents were teachers. How did I end up here? You know what I mean? But like, and I even remember in college, one of my close friends at the time, she's like, Allie, you can overanalyze anything to death. And I was like, I don't want to be, but like, now I know what was happening. It was because I hadn't dealt with, everything felt so uncertain, even the things that were like very benign. So I think this was a great point of overriding thoughts and feelings, is like, they're just going to come back stronger.
Absolutely.
So, all right. So we are going to take a pause and hear from our sponsor, and come back with going over the last two, which are actually pretty brief because we've gone for quite some time, but it's such a good conversation, and we'll be back. It's that time of year again. The live version of my annual group program, Why Am I Eating This Now?, opens for registration August 5th and begins August 13th. This program will help you unlock your keys to consistency with your nutrition goals. And with a small group of 15 people, we will get to the root causes of why you fall off track. Together, we'll transform those patterns and behaviors, no willpower required. To learn more, check out episode 6, season 5, where Why Am I Eating This Now participants, Dr. Tina Bugren and Lourdes Brawley, discuss how using adult development theory, which is not therapy or coaching, made the program so challenging, life-changing, and different from anything they've done before. A year later, they're still seeing results, impact, and feeling further transformed. Here's what they shared. Dr. Bugren said, Why Am I Eating This Now is about getting to the root of things, not hovering on the surface as too many other programs' plans do. As a result, I stopped slipping with my healthy eating and falling into old thought patterns. I got unstuck and have the tools to keep going. 1 year out of the Why Am I Eating This Now process and using the tools, I've lost 20 pounds and kept them off. Lourdes shared, I joined Why Am I Eating This Now because I wanted to move forward in my own self-development. I was able to discover the deeper conflict around my food battle, including how it protects me and how to move forward. I exceeded my own expectations for my progress, was challenged, and I will continue to make these changes in my life. I have been binge-free for over a year post Why Am I Eating This Now? I truly thought I'd never break free from emotional eating, but I have. And I am much bolder in my life. Yes, win-win. If you're ready to work smarter, not harder, to be consistent and reach your nutrition and wellness goals, join us. Full details are at AllieShapiro.com. Why Am I Eating This Now live program. And make sure you sign up on my list so that you can get the early bird discount. And if you don't want to wait, you can get started today with the self-study program now. What you pay for this will be credited towards the cost of the live program. So why not get started today and start getting relief and clarity? Okay. So on to willpower definition number 3, the conscious, effortful regulation of the self by the self. And again, I don't really have much to add to this one. Justine and I just went into in-depth what I mean by regulating ourselves is that we have to have the self-awareness, and it's not always easy, but it's always worthwhile, and it starts to get fun because you get more freedom and more choice. But some of the corresponding memes and myths that go along with this is the more you put in, the more you get out, right? No pain, no gain. When you feel like giving up, keep going. And again, if you start to understand what the right effort is, less is more. I was going over the Why Am I Eating This Now exit results of the program as I start to just, incorporate feedback of how to improve it. And one of the participants was like, I cannot believe the results I got from such the small effort that I put in. Now, if you've taken Why I'm Eating This Now, you may not say, you're like, it was hard. It was a challenging course. It is. But for some people, this stuff is so at the surface and it's so ready to change that making these pivots, it reduces the amount of tips and tricks and breathing and all the stuff that you need to do because you're doing the right action. And I feel like, I just want to say this, is that I feel like in the wellness community, and I mentioned this a little bit before, we talk about self-regulation or self-awareness. And it's like, again, be kind to yourself after a binge. Yes, do that. Binging is awful. I was in that hell for a decade. You have to have compassion for yourself. And you also have to have compassion and kindness and respect to say, I can look at this. I can get to the root cause. It's hard to do this work, and it's much harder to stay here and continue to have my belief in myself be eaten away, like metaphorically and literally. So I just want us to realize that most wellness experts are not versed in the change process. They're really good at, if we think of like a gas and a brake on our goals, they're great at the gas piece, right? No pain, no gain. The more you put in, the more you get out. Like kind of that, that militant sergeant, right?
Yes.
But the protective resistance, most of the wrong beliefs we have about our body are the brake. And it's like, okay, I want to go far, but it doesn't feel safe to take this foot off the brake. And so when you take the foot off the brake, you're removing resistance. You get clear on what you actually need to do. You do not need to do all the things. You can be a better curator. And so I just wanted to kind of plug that of things. And also that many clients confuse self-monitoring with self-awareness. And when I was talking to Justine about, especially as women, although when we're I'll stick with that thread. We are conditioned to know what looks good and know what's going to look good or what will look bad. And we're not always off. This podcast is all about being real. Like women are judged more for everything, right? And so part of this analyzing and doubt comes from really discernment of like, are we safe? Because we have to be contextual all the time. And I do mean physically safe, but I also mean emotionally safe, right? Because that's just as much of a risk. And so most self-monitoring, like I should do this or I have to do this, that's not self-awareness. I'm talking about what Justine talked about with like, wow, this made me feel uncertain going to my in-laws. And then I started to accommodate. And these are my behaviors when I accommodate. And this is some of the new things that I want to try because everyone can get their needs met in this situation. It doesn't have to be either or. And so that's really what I want us to remember about. And then then again, over time, growth mindset works. We get the results we want and it starts to get really fun because you start to feel so much more whole. You start to trust yourself so much more. You start to understand what you need, and what you need gets simpler as we get healthier, believe it or not. So I want to put that plug. Okay. And so then I think I'm trying to look for my fourth definition. Oh, so the key metrics there, are you getting more clear on what is your trigger and patterns, right? Our stress response is the compete, avoid, or accommodate, and the behaviors that go along with that. Is food and exercise getting more simple and intuitive rather than more complicated and a drag? Are you wanting to make the healthy choice more often? And is there less guilt and shame around falling off track and binges because you understand it has nothing to do with willpower or it being about you? Because if it's about us, then it's something we can't change. And then we're not in choice. So those are the things you want to start to look for that one. Justine, do you have anything to add to that before I get to our last one?
No, I feel like we've talked about that one, so
Yeah.
I don't have anything else.
One thing I would like you to share is how does it feel to know that like there's a trigger, a pattern in behaviors that as you become aware of, you can choose, and it's more about that than food.
Oh my God. It's so freeing, to be perfectly honest. Like it's one of those weird things. Like, so when in my process of like giving up all this dieting stuff, I think what I can say is like the more I dive into it and the more I realize like I am at choice, like it is literally mind-bogglingly freeing. Like I, realize that I can actually choose in the moment and then I don't have to react is beyond like, it's just one of those things like I didn't know that could be an option. And I feel like being able to like have that pause and like choice really feels more empowering than anything else.
Thank you for describing that. I have a private client that we're working with, and she's like, I feel like our work boils down to how am I not going to react and what are my choices to respond? And I'm like, yes, that's, and it sounds so simple. It's pretty complex because you have to, you have to more fine tune your nervous system because so much of this is about our nervous system and not a mental game.
Right.
But it is mind boggling freeing. And I think you hit on the challenging part is like, we don't know that that's possible. Like, because we're in this willpower surround sound. So thank you for sharing that. It's going to give a lot of people hope.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to say like on a personal note, like for me, like what I realized I had to do to get to that space was to like, how in dieting and everything, we demonize like certain foods. And the more that I demonized chocolate or whatever it was, like the more emotional power that food held over me. So in order to get to that space of choice, I had to eliminate that emotional attachment to that food by eating it and learning to trust myself with that food. And that's what's been able to put me in a place where like I get to choose if I want the chocolate or I don't.
Yeah. 100. That's why, I mean, kind of the body of my work is called truce with food because truce means you're neutral, right? And
right.
We talked about this in the Q&A call yesterday. It's like a lot of times people will be like, in the wellness world or these, spiritual influencers will be like, well, I'm sugar-free forever. And we're like, but that's just as extreme as binging. And you're still in the all or nothing pattern. And it's pretty radical and healthy to be like, I'm going to have a square and then I'm walking away.
Right. And just not have that emotional attachment to it. Like that's where you get that choice piece. And I feel like people are so afraid of all the bad foods, but you don't realize that like that fear is what's like keeping you stuck and out of the choice.
100%. And it's the fear and shame of like 1,000 pieces, right, that affect our health and weight and mood. It's not the one piece. So it's to your point that you said earlier. Great. Okay. And so I know we've gone a little long, but I think this is so rich for people. They're just going to eat it up. I can't stop the food pun. Oh my God.
You got to keep with the food pun.
I know. All right. The last one, which we'll wrap up pretty quickly here, is willpower definition 4 is a limited resource capable of being depleted. And it gets depleted by sleep, stress, when you shift your brain to a reward-seeking state from stress, self-criticism, and temptations. And I agree with this, right? At the heart, you need to eat to have willpower, but we all have limited energy. The only thing, there's not really much to add, except I would emphasize how important it is to give sleep. Our hunger cravings go up from a hormonal perspective when we're not getting enough sleep. And when it comes to stress, actually episode 7 of this season, I'm going to do a whole episode on how stress can actually uplevel your life in a really good way. But it's another reason to really tackle stress, because the more stressed you are, the more you shift your brain to a reward-seeking state. And I will say from a food perspective, the more stressed you get, the more you need more sugar and salt to give you the same dopamine hit. And that's why, again, you have to look at the physiology as well as the emotional piece. So we're going to show you how to crack the stress code in episode 7. Again, and then when it comes to self-criticism, the more you understand it's self-protection, the more you can have compassion and move through it rather than just ignoring it and avoiding it and resisting it. And, this is just my little feminist plug. Every book I've ever seen about an inner critic is directed at women. I have yet to see one about men. I know men are hard on themselves in other ways. However, I want to point out that women, we don't hate ourselves as much as we want to believe we do. We want to be safe. All that inner critic stuff is inner protection stuff. We are not uniquely hating ourselves, okay? We're trying to protect ourselves. And once you really get that and really understand your own process and self-awareness, you just bring this compassion of, this is why I'm doing this, to keep myself safe. Safe is a basic need. So I just want to say, you do not hate yourself as much as you think you do, but you are trying to keep yourself safe because you're smart and discerning. It's just maybe a little bit too much tuned, too high tuned. And my work with clients is always to get them from reactive and defensive to discerning. We don't want to take away all the hard-earned wisdom. Yeah. And lastly, with temptations, food does not have to be a temptation in your life. And I think Justine, using that chocolate example, gave a perfect example. The more you can feel safe in a variety of environments and situations, the less you need food as an attempt at attachment and safety. And the neat thing is, when you really feel at peace around food, the times you genuinely want to eat something indulgent, you'll actually enjoy it. That's the big payoff, right?
Crazy.
Yeah. And part of that process is getting that if I eat a piece of cake, there's no long-term consequences, right? And we have to live through that. Mm-hmm. We have to see that, hey, I do stop eventually, or I'm not gaining all this weight I thought I would, or I do eventually get sick of it, right?
Yeah. I think it's just like being patient with the time. Like I've been probably working on this stuff for like a year and a half, and I'm only part of the way there. So I hope that people, that your listeners are willing to give themselves the time that this takes.
Yeah. I love that you say that too, because we often think, like I have one client who's like, well, your process is not the quick fix, Allie. And I was like, no, but I would say it's a quicker fix than the 20 years of dieting you tried. She's like, oh yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
And I shouldn't have said her voice like that, but I mean, my clients are brutally honest with me. And I'm like, no, I never claimed this is a quick fix. It takes time, and it takes a lot less time. I know a lot of my clients, especially who are in their 50s or 60s, are like, oh, I wish I would have started this earlier. And I'm like, oh, we get to it when we get to it. I don't know. So the point of all of this, though, is that you should feel great about your choice in the short and long term.
Absolutely.
And the key metrics with this belief are, am I sleeping better? With stress, you have more choices than just black and white thinking. And again, if you are really unfamiliar with this or want to learn more, episode 7 at the end of this season is what we'll be talking about. Stress does not have to throw you off track, and life does not just have to happen to you. We have a lot more choice. Self-criticism, the more you can feel at peace, relaxed, and natural in situations that used to stress you out. I had a client who, through doing our work together, even though, we're focused on her story and her patterns and her triggers and all that stuff, but she was amazed at how she just traveled recently. And she's like, I used to get so nervous with traveling, meeting the connecting flights, and I would eat because I was nervous. And she was like, I didn't have that this time. And I'm like, because you trust yourself more and you know that you can be more resourceful and you have choices. So again, that self-criticism, which is a largely self-protection, you will start to feel calmer and be able to be more present, which is Justine's goal, not just around food, but in life, which was cool because then she didn't need wine to come down from her trip, which was awesome.
Yeah.
Temptations, you'll start to look forward to experiences beyond the food, and you can easily walk past old tempting foods, and they don't taste as good because you can get satisfied from a little bit. And then this is probably one of my equally favorite things, in addition to the health and freedom people feel, is you'll have all this energy and willpower to put into other areas of your life. Because I've shared plenty of times how weight loss became a hobby. I did not know what I wanted to do with my life, which is why it took me a while to get out of corporate and switch. But there's just so many payoffs for really reframing willpower and doing the work of self-awareness. Justine, any closing questions or thoughts?
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation. I loved it.
Oh my God. People they're going to relate to you, and they're going to learn so much from your examples. So thank you for being here. And I just do want to tell you guys that the summer theme in the Insatiable membership community is consistency. So if you want to explore, your compete, avoid, or accommodate patterns more, join us for the summer. You can join us at allyshapiro.com/IC2019. I'll also include the link in the show notes, as well as to Why I'm Eating This Now, which is coming up mid-August. And all the episodes and articles I mentioned in this episode, including Dr. Carol Dweck's follow-up on growth mindset, and also include a community favorite episode that's the difference between food and exercise willpower, that looks at what we talked about, drilling down from exercise and food perspective. So Justine, thank you so much for being here. And thanks for everyone who's hung on to the end. Talk about willpower, right?
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Health Rebels, for tuning in today. Have a reaction, question, or want the transcript from today's episode? Find me at allyshapiro.com. I'd love if you leave a review on Apple Podcast and tell your friends and family about Insatiable. It helps us grow our community and share a new way of approaching health and our bodies. Thanks for engaging in a different kind of conversation. And remember, always, your body truths are unique, profound, real, and liberating.